The high-planed sun hammered the dusty main street of Harmony Creek, bleaching the life from the clapboard storefronts until they seemed like the bones of some long-dead beast. Inside the First Territorial Bank, the air was thick with the scent of stale paper metal coin and the quiet desperation of a long drought. Joseph McGrath stood at the teller's window, his broad shoulders stooped slightly, the weight of a decade's solitude etched into the lines around his eyes. He was a blacksmith from the neighboring town of Redemption, a man whose strength was measured in the iron he shaped, but whose spirit felt forged from something far more brittle. He had come for supplies, a rare trip from the quiet rhythm of his forge, and now found himself caught in the slow, grinding gears of a commerce. Suddenly, the lazy afternoon shattered. The batwing doors of the bank exploded inward, slamming against the walls with a crack like rifle fire. 3 men, their faces hidden behind grimy bandanas, stormed the lobby. Their movements were a study in brutal efficiency. One vaulted the counter, his revolver, a black slash, against the pale-faced clerk's throat. Another stood guard at the door, a shotgun held steady its twin barrels, promising indiscriminate ruin. The third, the leader, moved to the center of the room, his voice a low growl that cut through the sudden, terrified silence. On the floor, now hands where I can see him. Panic erupted. A woman screamed a choked bird-like sound that was quickly silenced. Joseph reacted on instinct, not with heroism, but with the grim pragmatism of a man who understood violence. He pushed the elderly man beside him to the floor, shielding him with his own body as he went down, his cheek pressed against the grimy, spittoon-stained floorboards. The air filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder and fear. The robbery was a blur of frantic motion and barked commands. Sacks were filled with a frantic metallic clatter. The leader stalked the room, his boots kicking up dust, his eyes cold and dark above the bandana, scanning the terrified faces on the floor. He passed Joseph, his boot heel coming down inches from his hand. Joseph remained utterly still, his heart a steady, heavy drum against his ribs. He was not a lawman, not a hero. He was just a man trying to survive another day in a world that had already taken too much. Then chaos found its own rhythm. The man behind the counter shoved the last of the money into a canvas bag and tossed it to his leader. In the exchange, something small and silver slipped from the leader's waistcoat pocket, arcing through the dusty air. It landed on the floorboards, with a soft, almost inaudible clink, skittering to a stop near Joseph's head. His blood ran cold. He knew that object. He knew its weight, its shape, the delicate etching of a single wildflower on its surface. It was a locket, a silver locket he had commissioned himself 10 years ago, forged with his own hands in the heat of a love he believed would last a lifetime. He had placed it around Mariana Clark's neck on a summer evening filled with the scent of pine and promises the night before her family sent her away to marry a man of better means. The robbers were backing toward the door, their job done. Nobody moves for 5 minutes, the leader snarled, his voice muffled by the cloth. But Joseph's world had narrowed to that single, impossible point of light on the floor. His mind reeled. Mariana involved in this. It was unthinkable. The Mariana he knew was gentle, kind, her spirit as bright and untarnished as the silver he had polished for her. Had the world broken her so completely? Was she in danger, forced into a life of crime? As the robbers vanished into the blinding sunlight, the spell broke. People began to stir, whimpering, coughing in the dust. The bank manager shouted for the sheriff. But Joseph moved with a singular purpose. His large, calloused hand closed around the locket, the metal cool against his skin. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the questions and the commotion, and walked out of the bank. The silver locket felt like a lead weight in his palm, a tangible piece of a past that had just violently collided with his present. He stood in the street, the sun beating down on him, the shouts from the bank fading into a dull roar. The mystery of the locket was a hook in his soul, pulling him back toward a decade of unanswered questions and a ghost that he had never managed to outrun. The road back to redemption felt longer than ever, each mile paved with a new terrifying uncertainty. Redemption was a town that lived up to its name, only in the most ironic sense. It was a place where pasts came to die, a small collection of buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, unforgiving wilderness of cracked earth and sun-scorched mesas. Joseph McGrath's blacksmith shop stood at the edge of town, its rhythmic clang of hammer on steel a lonely heartbeat against the prevailing silence. Here, in the searing heat of the forge, he beat his solitude into shape, crafting horseshoes and mending wagon wheels, his life pared down to the simple, honest work of his hands. His home was a small Spartan cabin behind the shop, its porch offering a view of the endless horizon, a vista as empty and vast as the space Mariana had left in his life. The locket now sat on his mantelpiece, a cold silver question mark in the dim light. The town itself was populated by souls as weathered as the landscape. Sheriff Hardin was a man whose sense of justice had long been eroded by pragmatism. He kept the peace not with a quick draw, but with a weary sigh and an understanding that most men's troubles were of their own making. Abigail Tate, the owner of the town's only inn, served as Redemption's central nervous system. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her tongue lubricated by a steady stream of gossip ensured no secret stayed buried for long. She treated Joseph with a kind of pitying respect, seeing him as a tragic figure, a good man tethered to a memory. Then there was Caleb Pike. Younger than Joseph, with a restless energy and a tongue as sharp as a razor pike, had an inexplicable animosity for him. He was a ranch hand competent enough, but his true talent lay in sowing discord. His words were his primary weapon, laced with a sly, cutting wit that could unnerve the most stoic of men. He often watched Joseph from the saloon porch, a smirk playing on his lips. Still waiting on a ghost, McGrath he'd call out his voice, carrying easily in the quiet air. Joseph never rose to the bait. His silence was a wall thick and unbreachable, but he felt Pike's antagonism like a constant low-grade fever. He couldn't place its source, but it felt personal, rooted in something deeper than simple town rivalry. Days bled into weeks. The memory of the bank robbery festered the locket, a constant silent accusation on his mantle. He asked quiet questions of travelers passing through, described the robbers, the locket, but no one knew anything. The gang had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The mystery deepened, coiling around his heart. He tried to lose himself in his work, the sweat and fire of the forge, a welcome punishment. But every night he would return to his cabin, and the sight of that silver wildflower, a symbol of a past that was no longer dormant. The shrill whistle of the afternoon train was a familiar sound, usually marking nothing more than the passage of time. But on this day, it carried a different note, a herald of fate. Joseph was crossing the street from the general store when he saw the small crowd gathering at the station. He paid it little mind until a figure emerged from the billowing steam, a woman stepping down from the passenger car. She moved with a weariness that seemed to settle in her very bones, a carpet bag clutched in one hand. Even from a distance he knew her. The world tilted on its axis. It was Mariana. 10 years had passed, but the way she held her head, the slender line of her neck, the quiet grace in her posture, it was all achingly familiar. As she drew closer, the changes became brutally apparent. The vibrant light in her eyes had been replaced by a haunted exhaustion. Her dress was faded, her shawl threadbare. The beauty was still there, but it was a beauty carved from hardship, a fragile flame that had weathered a terrible storm. She was not the triumphant widow returning to her roots. She was a woman adrift, washed ashore with nothing but the clothes on her back and an invisible burden of shame. Their eyes met across the dusty expanse. For a heartbeat, the noise of the town and the rattling wagons, the distant clang of his own apprentice at the forge, the low murmur of the crowd vanished. In her gaze, he saw a flicker of recognition, followed swiftly by a wave of profound humiliation. She looked away, her chin dropping her shoulders, hunching as if to shield herself from his sight. The connection, so electric and sudden, was severed. The whispers started immediately spreading through the crowd like a grass fire. Abigail Tate was the first to give them voice, her words heavy with judgment. Mariana Clark, back with nothing but a worn-out name. Caleb Pike, lounging against a support beam, let out a low, cruel laugh. Well, look at that McGrath, he drawled, his voice pitched for Joseph to hear. Your ghost decided to come home to haunt you in person. Careful. Ghosts have a way of dragging good men down into the dust with them. Joseph ignored him. His entire being was focused on Mariana. He watched her approach the inn, her steps faltering as she saw Abigail's cold, appraising stare. He saw the transaction of pity and disdain as Mariana secured a room. The past he had tried to bury was no longer a memory. It was here, breathing the same dusty air, sleeping under a roof just down the street. And with her arrival, the quiet truce he had made with his life was irrevocably broken. The locket on his mantle was no longer just a mystery about a stranger. It was now inextricably linked to the broken woman who had just stepped off the train, forcing him to confront not only his own past, but the terrifying possibility of her hidden, desperate present. Mariana's presence settled over redemption, like a low-hanging cloud seeding the dry ground for a storm of gossip. Joseph's first instinct was to go to her to bridge the 10-year chasm with words of comfort, but the shame in her eyes held him at bay. He understood that pride was all she had left, a brittle shield against the world's scorn, and he would not be the one to shatter it. Instead, he chose to help from the shadows, his actions a silent language of support. That first evening, he purchased a hot meal from the saloon stew, thick with beef and potatoes, and a loaf of fresh bread. He left the parcel at the door to her room at the inn, knocked once softly, and retreated into the darkness of the hallway before she could answer. Through the thin wood, he heard her hesitant footsteps and the click of the latch, and then a silence so profound it seemed to hold a world of gratitude and sorrow. He walked away, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, the phantom limb of a life they were supposed to have shared. His quiet aid became a daily ritual. A stack of freshly chopped firewood would appear on her porch. A loose shutter would be fixed while she was at the general store. He spoke to the stable owner, a man indebted to him for a past kindness, and arranged for Mariana to find work, mending harnesses and blankets, small, respectable labor that would give her a few coins and a measure of dignity. But for every step Joseph took to ease her path, Caleb Pike took two to obstruct it. Caleb moved through the town like a poison dripping venom into willing ears. He painted Mariana as a manipulative woman of ill repute come back to bleed Joseph dry. He'd sit at the saloon buying rounds for the local hands and spin his cruel narrative. McGrath's a fool, he'd say with a knowing smirk. She played him once, left him for a richer man. Now that the money's gone, she's back to pick the bones clean. Abigail Tate became his unwitting amplifier. She takes his charity without a word of thanks. She'd confide to customers at the inn, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. A decent woman would have too much pride. She's got him wrapped around her little finger just like before. The campaign was brutally effective. When Mariana went to the general store, the proprietor would serve her with a cold formality, his eyes averted. Mothers would pull their children closer as she passed. The few smiles she received in her first days curdled into suspicious stares. She was isolated, quarantined by rumor, her shame a tangible thing that walked beside her down the street. Joseph felt the town's hostility, as if it were directed at him. He saw the pain it caused Mariana in the way her shoulders slumped a little lower each day, the way the light in her eyes dimmed even further. One afternoon he found her behind the stables, her hands raw from scrubbing a horse blanket, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was trying to rethread a heavy needle, but her fingers trembled too much. He approached slowly, his shadow falling over her. She looked up startled and quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Let me," he said, his voice rough but gentle. He took the needle and thick thread from her, his large, sure hands making quick work of the task. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on the simple mechanics of the work. "Why are you doing this, Joseph?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't owe me anything. You're only making them hate you too." "What they think doesn't matter," he replied, handing the needle back to her. "Some debts don't fade." "This isn't a debt," she insisted, her voice gaining a sharp edge of desperation. "It's pity. I don't want your pity." He finally met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a decade of unspoken feeling. It was never pity, Mariana. Not then, not now. The moment hung between them, thick with the ghosts of what might have been. But before she could respond, Caleb Pike's voice cut through the air. He was leading a horse from the stable, his path taking him deliberately close to them. Touching scene. Caleb sneered, his eyes flicking from Joseph's stoic face to Mariana's tear-streaked one. The fallen woman and her noble protector. "Be careful she doesn't tarnish that shiny reputation of yours, McGrath." Joseph's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. A dangerous stillness fell over him. For a long moment, the only sound was the stamping of Caleb's horse and the ragged rhythm of Mariana's breathing. He wanted to strike the smirk from Pike's face, to answer the cruelty with the simple, satisfying language of violence. But he looked at Mariana, at the sheer terror in her eyes, not of Caleb, but for him. And the anger subsided, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. A fist fight would only prove Caleb's point, casting him as a brute, fighting over a sullied woman. It would destroy what little peace he had managed to build for her. He unclenched his fists. "You're not worth the trouble, Pike," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He turned his back on the man, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any blow, and walked away, leaving Caleb standing there with his unspent venom. But Joseph knew this was only the beginning. The town's hostility, so skillfully orchestrated by Pike, was an obstacle he could not simply break. He had to understand its source, or it would consume them both. The sheer intensity of Caleb Pike's malice was a burr under Joseph's saddle. It wasn't the casual cruelty of a town bully. It was personal, obsessive, and aimed with surgical precision at both him and Mariana. Joseph began to dig, turning over the rocks of redemption's past in search of the snake coiled beneath. His first stop was Sheriff Hardin. He found the lawman on the porch of his office, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, a habit he had when the town was quiet and his thoughts were long. Joseph leaned against the porch rail, foregoing pleasantries. "Hardin, you know most every family that's passed through this county. You ever know a Pike family to have trouble, real trouble?" The sheriff paused, his whittling, his eyes distant. Pike. Yeah, I remember a family by that name. Had a small claim up near the old North Star mine years back. Father and 2 sons. Hard workers, but they had a run of bad luck that'd curdle milk. The father, Silas, lost the whole claim. Heard he drank himself into an early grave after that. What happened to the sons? Joseph pressed, his gut tightening. The older one, Daniel, I think his name was. He married a girl from out of town, moved away, tried to make a go of it somewhere else. The younger one, can't rightly recall his name. Just a boy back then. He drifted off after his father died. Never saw him again. Hardin looked up, his gaze sharp. Why the sudden interest in the Pikes, Joseph? Just a loose thread I'm trying to tie off, Joseph said, keeping his voice even. He thanked the sheriff and left the name Daniel echoing in his mind. Mariana's late husband had been named Daniel. It could be a coincidence, but in a town as small as Redemption, coincidences were rare and often dangerous. His next stop was the county records office, a dusty room filled with heavy leather-bound ledgers that smelled of decaying paper and time. He spent hours poring over the brittle pages, his finger tracing the lines of transactions and land deeds. And then he found it. A deed of transfer for the North Star silver claim. The seller, Silas Pike. The buyer, Alistair McGrath, his own father. The date was almost 15 years ago. A cold dread washed over him. His father had been a hard man, driven and ambitious, with a reputation for deals that always left him on top, often at the expense of the other party. He had never spoken of the North Star mine, and Joseph, then a young man eager to make his own way, had never asked. Armed with this new unsettling knowledge, Joseph's interactions with Mariana took on a new urgency. Their shared adversity had forged a fragile bridge between them. The formal distance was gone, replaced by a quiet companionship. They would often walk at dusk, heading out of town where the sky opened up and the whispers couldn't follow. It was during one of these walks that he gently broached the subject of her past. Your husband, Daniel Joseph began, his voice careful. You said he was taken by fever and misfortune. Mariana stopped, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the setting sun bled across the alkali flats, turning the cracked earth to iron and blood. The fever was real enough, she said, her voice hollow. But the misfortune, that came first. He was a good man, Joseph. A proud man. He wanted to build a world for me. He invested everything we had in a venture, something from his past. It failed. It didn't just fail, it destroyed him. He lost the money, but it was the shame that killed him. He couldn't bear to look at me, to see what he thought was his own failure reflected in my eyes. The fever took his body, but his spirit was already gone. Did he ever tell you what the venture was? Joseph asked, his heart pounding. She shook her head. No, he was too proud. He spoke of family debts and the price of a good name. He said his family had been wronged long ago, and he was trying to reclaim their honor. But it was all just dust. In the end, it was all just dust. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more terrible than he could have imagined. Daniel Pike, the son of Silas Pike. His family's ruin tied to a land deal with Alistair McGrath. Mariana, his widow, now being tormented by a man named Caleb Pike. A younger brother lost to history who had drifted away. It couldn't be. That evening, a storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick with the smell of ozone and distant rain. Joseph saw Caleb Pike leaving the saloon, his stride unsteady. Driven by a desperate need for the truth, Joseph followed him into the alleyway, between the saloon and the feed store. He cornered him against the rough-hewn wall, his hand grabbing the front of Pike's shirt. What is your game? Pike, Joseph demanded, his voice a low growl. This isn't about town gossip. This is about her. It's about me. Why? Caleb laughed, a bitter, broken sound that held no humor. He looked Joseph in the eye, and for the first time, the mocking smirk was gone, replaced by a raw, bottomless hatred. You really don't know, do you? Caleb spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You McGraths. You take everything, ruin everything, and you don't even remember the names of the people whose lives you destroy. He shoved Joseph's hand away, straightening his shirt with a sharp tug. He stood tall, his eyes burning with the fire of a long-nursed grudge. My name is Caleb Pike, he said, the words falling like stones in the charged air. Daniel Pike was my brother. And your father, Alistair McGrath, with you standing right beside him as his promising son, ruined him. Ruined us all. My brother didn't die of some convenient fever. He put a pistol in his mouth because he couldn't bear the shame your family heaped upon him. I've spent years waiting for the right moment to collect on that debt. And now you've brought Mariana, my brother's wife, the last thing my family has, right back to me. I'm not just going to run her out of town. I'm going to destroy your name, your life, and everything you hold dear. I'm going to make you feel the same emptiness your father left us with. This is just the beginning, McGrath. You haven't even begun to pay. The revelation struck Joseph with the force of a physical blow. The world seemed to drop out from under him, leaving him suspended in a terrible, silent void. Caleb Pike was Daniel's brother. His entire campaign of cruelty wasn't random. It was revenge. A carefully plotted war fought with whispers and lies, and Joseph had been its unwitting target from the start. Caleb's words hung in the air, a declaration of intent that promised a far darker and more violent conflict to come. The confession hung in the air between them, a poison that changed everything. Caleb's war was no longer one of shadows and whispers. It was out in the open, raw and personal. With the truth revealed, his methods grew bolder, more direct. The veiled threats gave way to open sabotage. One morning, Joseph arrived at his smithy to find the forge cold, and the bellows slashed the leather sliced open with a vindictive precision. A day's work, a week's income was lost. He spent the entire day meticulously stitching the thick leather, his knuckles bleeding, his jaw set in a grim line. He knew who was responsible, but there was no proof. No witnesses would come forward against Caleb Pike, not when he had the town so firmly in his grip. The attacks escalated. A fence on Joseph's small plot of land was cut during the night, his 2 horses scattered into the scrubland. It took him half a day under the brutal sun to track them down. While he was gone, someone had painted a single cruel word on Mariana's door at the inn whore. Abigail Tate had scrubbed it off before Mariana saw it. Her expression a mixture of fear and guilt, but the damage was done. The word was on everyone's lips. The town, which had once been merely hostile, was now a cage. Mariana grew gaunt, the shadows under her eyes deepening. She rarely left her room, the world outside having become too sharp, too painful to navigate. Joseph felt a suffocating helplessness. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with his hands with fire and steel. But this enemy was insidious. How could he fight a ghost? How could he undo the sins of his father, sins he hadn't even known existed? He tried to reason with Caleb one evening, finding him alone by the town well. This is between you and me, Pike. Joseph said, his voice low and steady. It's about our fathers. Leave Mariana out of it. She's suffered enough. Caleb laughed, a harsh grating sound. She's the entire point, McGrath. She was my brother's wife. She carries his name, his memory. By tarnishing her, I tarnish him. By saving her, you try to wash your family's blood money clean. Everything you do to help her just proves my point. You think you can buy redemption? You can't. It has to be paid for in flesh and bone. His eyes were alight with a zealot's fire, his grief having curdled into a righteous, all-consuming crusade. Joseph saw then that there was no reasoning with him. Caleb was living in a story he had written years ago, and he would see it through to its bitter end. The isolation was complete. The few townspeople who had remained neutral now sided with Caleb, fearing his wrath or simply tired of the disruption. Joseph and Mariana were utterly alone. Two figures stranded on a desert island, the sea of public opinion having turned against them. The breaking point came with the sandstorm. It rolled in from the west, a monstrous roiling wall of brown dust that swallowed the sun and plunged the world into a gritty twilight. The wind howled through the streets of Redemption, a mournful banshee cry that rattled windows and tore at loose shingles. It was a storm of biblical proportions, turning day into an apocalyptic night. Joseph was securing his shop hammering boards over the windows when a sudden, sickening premonition seized him. Mariana. He raced to the inn, battling the gale that tore at his clothes and filled his lungs with dust. He found her room empty. The door was unlocked, swinging on its hinges, and her thin shawl lay on the floor near an overturned chair. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that Caleb had taken her. The storm was the perfect cover, the chaos a perfect accomplice. He burst into the saloon, the storm following him in a cloud of grit. Sheriff Hardin and a few others were hunkered down, whiskey glasses in hand. Pike took her. Joseph yelled over the roar of the wind. He took Mariana. Hardin was on his feet instantly. Where would he go? The North Star. Joseph said the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. The abandoned silver mine, the symbolic heart of their family's tragedy. It was the only place Caleb would take her to stage his final terrible act of vengeance. "You can't go out in this, McGrath, it's suicide," Hardin shouted. But Joseph was already gone, plunging back into the raging storm. He saddled his most sure-footed horse, pulling his bandana over his face to filter the suffocating dust. He was no longer just a blacksmith or a solitary man. He was a force of nature answering another, a man driven by a singular purpose to reclaim the woman he loved from the ghosts of a past that would not stay buried. The wind screamed around him, but in his heart there was a terrible, resolute silence. He rode into the maelstrom, a lone figure against the fury of the heavens, the final confrontation awaiting him in the dark, unstable belly of the earth. The world outside was a howling, blinding chaos. Dust and sand scoured Joseph's skin, and the wind shrieked like a tortured soul threatening to tear him from the saddle. He rode by instinct, his horse a phantom shape beneath him, navigating the treacherous landscape more by memory than by sight. The North Star mine was miles from town, nestled in a narrow canyon, a place long abandoned to the ghosts of failure. It was there, in that heart of darkness, that Caleb Pike would play his final hand. He found Caleb's horse tethered near the mine's entrance, its head bowed against the storm. The entrance itself was a black maw framed by rotting timbers that groaned under the assault of the wind. A single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow from within its light, flickering, threatening to be extinguished at any moment. Joseph dismounted his hand, going to the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. He had no gun. This was not a fight he intended to win with bullets. It was a reckoning that had to be met face to face. He slipped inside his eyes, adjusting to the gloom. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The mine shaft sloped downward, the lantern light casting long dancing shadows that twisted and writhed like tormented spirits. He could hear their voices echoing up from the depths, Caleb's sharp and triumphant, and Mariana's quiet but unbroken. He found them in a large chamber at the bottom of the main shaft, a cavern supported by massive decaying timbers. Caleb had tied Mariana to one of the central posts, her hands bound behind her. She was not crying. Her chin was held high, her eyes full of fear, but also defiance were fixed on her captor. Caleb was pacing before her, his face a mask of manic energy illuminated by the swaying lantern. "Here he is," Caleb cried as Joseph stepped into the light, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. The noble McGrath come to rescue the damsel. Just as I planned. He held a revolver, its barrel gleaming in the lantern light, but it was not pointed at Mariana. It was pointed at his own chest. This isn't about a ransom, McGrath, Caleb said, his eyes wild. This is about a confession. I want you to tell her. I want you to tell her everything. How your father, that righteous, respectable man, was nothing but a thief. How he saw my father's desperation and used it to bleed him dry, offering him a loan against the mine at an impossible rate, knowing he'd default. How he bought our future for pennies on the dollar and left us with nothing. I want you to admit your family's sin right here in the place where it happened. Joseph's gaze went to Mariana. He saw the confusion and fear warring in her expression. This was Caleb's endgame, not just to kill him, but to destroy her memory of him first, to force him to confess to a legacy of greed, and ruin her respect for him in the process. My father was a hard man, Joseph began, his voice echoing in the cavern. He made deals that hurt people. If he wronged your family, that is a stain on my name, and I will carry it. But I was not a part of it. I was young, and he never spoke to me of his business. Liar. Caleb screamed, the sound ricocheting off the rock walls. You stood by his side. You benefited from our ruin. You lived a comfortable life, while my brother ate his heart out with shame. The timbers above them groaned a deep, resonant sound like a dying beast. A shower of dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The storm outside was putting an unbearable strain on the old mine. It was then that Mariana spoke, her voice, cutting through the tension, clear and strong. You're wrong, Caleb. Both men turned to look at her, shocked into silence. Daniel never told me, she said, her eyes locked on Caleb's. He never told me any of it. He was too proud. He let me believe it was his own failure, his own weakness. He carried that lie to his grave to protect his own pride. All these years I have mourned a man I never truly knew, and all these years you have hated a man for a crime he didn't commit. The secondary twist, the simple, devastating truth of it, landed in the small cavern with the force of a cave-in. Mariana had been as much a victim of Daniel's pride as she was of the McGrath family's greed. Caleb stared at her, his face slack with disbelief. The entire foundation of his revenge, the righteous fury that had fueled him for a decade, crumbled in an instant. His crusade was built on a half-truth, his hatred misplaced. Mariana wasn't a prize to be reclaimed. She was another casualty of the same tragedy that had destroyed his family. No, Caleb whispered, shaking his head. No, he would have told me. A deafening crack echoed from above. A massive support beam splintered, and the ceiling began to collapse. Rocks and dirt rained down. Joseph didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, not at Caleb, but at Mariana, pulling his knife and slicing through the ropes that bound her. He threw himself over her, shielding her with his body, as the chamber began to implode. Caleb stood frozen for a second, his face a canvas of agony and confusion as his world fell apart literally and figuratively. He looked at the collapsing roof, then at the revolver in his hand, and then at Joseph, shielding the woman he had wronged. In that last moment, a flicker of something, clarity, remorse, acceptance, crossed his face. He didn't try to run. He simply stood his ground as the North Star mine, the tomb of his family's legacy, claimed him as its own. Joseph grabbed Mariana's hand. We have to go. Now, he yelled over the roar. He pulled her through the swirling dust and chaos, back up the sloping shaft, choking on the thick air. Behind them, the mine gave a final terminal groan and collapsed entirely, sealing the cavern and Caleb Pike's fate within it. They stumbled out into the storm, which was already beginning to subside, its fury spent. They fell to their knees at the entrance, gasping for air, covered in dirt. the howling wind a mournful dirge for the man, and the hatred buried below. The sandstorm abated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured clean, the air tasting of rain and wet earth. The sky was a bruised purple, the first stars beginning to emerge. Joseph and Mariana huddled at the mouth of the collapsed mine, the silence between them vast and profound. It was a silence not of shame or distance, but of shared trauma and the staggering weight of revelation. Within the hour, they saw the bobbing lights of lanterns. Sheriff Hardin and a small posse had ridden out as soon as the worst of the storm had passed. The sheriff's face was grim as he surveyed the scene, the caved-in mine, the exhausted and battered pair. McGrath Hardin's voice was rough with concern. "Mariana, are you all right?" "We're all right," Joseph answered, his voice hoarse. He got to his feet, helping Mariana up. "Pike, he's gone." The mine collapsed. There were no more questions. The truth would come out. But for now, the simple facts were enough. They rode back to redemption in silence, the posse a respectful distance behind them. The town, when they entered it, seemed different. The storm had washed away the dust, and in the clean, quiet streets, the weight of judgment felt lighter. News of the kidnapping and the mine collapse spread quickly, and the narrative that Caleb Pike had so carefully constructed began to unravel. People looked at Joseph and Mariana not with scorn, but with a dawning sense of awe and contrition. In the days that followed, the full story emerged pieced together from Joseph's quiet account to the sheriff, and the sudden remorseful confessions of people like Abigail Tate, who now saw her role in the town's cruelty with shameful clarity. The town reckoned with itself with the ease in which they had condemned two people based on the whispers of a vengeful man. The hostility that had poisoned the air for weeks evaporated, replaced by a quiet, collective guilt. Joseph and Mariana retreated into the simple solitude of his cabin. The full truth of their shared history now lay between them, a complex tapestry of pain, misunderstanding, and the sins of their families. They had to navigate this new landscape together. "My father's money. It feels tainted now," Joseph said one evening, staring into the fire. He was looking at the old lockbox, where his inheritance, the profits from his father's hard-won and sometimes ruthless life, were kept. It was built on the ruin of men like Silas Pike. "It wasn't your sin, Joseph," Mariana said softly, placing her hand on his arm. "You can't carry the burden of his choices." "But I can choose what to do now," he replied, a new resolve in his eyes. "I can't change what he did, but I can make something good from it." Their healing was slow, measured in quiet conversations and shared simple tasks. They processed the revelations, forgiving the ghosts that had haunted them. Joseph, the memory of a father he loved but never fully understood. Mariana, the memory of a husband whose pride had cost them everything. They were no longer defined by the past, but by the choice they were making to build a future together. Months passed. The harshness of winter gave way to the tentative green of spring. Redemption began to live up to its name. The first sign was the reconstruction of the town church, its steeple having been damaged in the storm. The project was funded by a single anonymous donation, but everyone knew it came from Joseph McGrath. It was his public act of atonement, a way to use his father's controversial fortune to rebuild something for the entire community. The clang of hammers on new wood replaced the sound of whispers, and with each new plank, the town's wounds began to heal. One clear, cool afternoon, Mariana walked alone to the small, windswept cemetery on the edge of town. She found the simple wooden marker where her late husband, Daniel Pike, was buried. There was no name, only a date. From her pocket, she took the silver locket, the one from the bank robbery which the authorities had returned to Joseph when their investigation led nowhere. The mystery of how a robber came to possess it was a loose thread that would likely never be tied, but its journey had brought it home. It had been a symbol of a youthful promise between her and Joseph, but it had ended up a relic of a different tragic life. She knelt and gently placed the locket on the earth at the base of the marker, its silver gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was a final act of closure, of letting go of the man she thought she knew, and the life of sorrow he had unknowingly bequeathed her. She didn't look back as she walked away from the grave, her steps light and sure. Her path led her toward a new homestead being built on a rise overlooking the town. The frame of a small house stood stark against the vast blue sky. Joseph was there, hammer in hand, his silhouette strong and steady. He saw her coming and laid his hammer down, a slow smile spreading across his face. He walked to meet her, and they stood together hand in hand, looking out at the endless horizon, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past. They were free, their future, a clean, unwritten page ready to be filled, not with stories of shame or revenge, but with the quiet, enduring language of a love that had against all odds survived.